Today's documentary is called Rising from Shattered Roots. We will discuss 5 themes from the Indigenous film called Indian Horse. The first theme is family and traditions. Richard Vagamese's Indian Horse is a powerful story of family, tradition, and resilience. The film follows Saul Indian Horse, a young boy from the Fish Clan, an indigenous Canadian tribe near the Winnipeg River. Saul's family has always been influential within the Fish Clan, with his great grandfather Slanting Sky serving as a shaman and spiritual leader. But Saul's journey takes place during a turbulent time, the 1960s and 70s, when indigenous traditions were under attack. The Indian Act of Residential Schools sought to erase indigenous cultures by separating children from their families and forcing them to abandon their heritage. Saul struggles to maintain ties to his family and culture while navigating the harsh realities of these schools. Now we are going to transition to images of elders, indigenous women, and Saul's grandmother. The Fish clan culture places great importance on family and respect for elders, especially women. Saul's grandmother Naomi is a guiding force, leading her family with wisdom, courage, and spiritual strength. The family's deep connection to nature is another cornerstone of the tradition. They believe that forests and lakes, like the sacred God's Lake, offer enlightenment meant for only certain families. For Saul, tradition is not abstract, it's a lived experience, passed down through visions and dreams of his ancestors. These mystical connections remind him of his identity and purpose, even when he feels lost. But Saul's story is also about balance. While he embraces his family's proud traditions, he also adapts to the changing world around him. He learns English, plays hockey, and incorporates aspects of white Canadian culture into his life. Wagami shows us that honoring the past while living in the present is the key to resilience. Through his journey, Saul Indian Horse discovers that family and tradition are inseparable. They are his strength, his community, and his legacy, a reminder that we carry our ancestors with us no matter where we go. The next theme we're going to discuss is cultural genocide. In 1994, the United Nations defined cultural genocide as any action which has the aim or effect of depriving an ethnic group of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. By this definition, the Canadian government's policies in the 20th century qualify as one of the most flagrant cultural genocides of modern times. For over a century, Indigenous Canadian children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to Christian English speaking schools. This was not just an education policy, it was a calculated effort to erase indigenous cultures, languages, and identities. In Richard Wagamese's Indian Horse, the devastating effects of this culture genocide are portrayed through the eyes of Saul Indian Horse, a young boy sent to State Jerome's residential school. It is a school filled with sadness and harsh conditions. At State Jerome's, Saul is subjected to a brutal system designed to strip him of his heritage. His siblings Benjamin and Rachel are taken from their family, causing immense grief to their parents. Saul's own abduction is a disorienting effect, as he is torn away from his dying grandmother without compassion or explanation. Saul, like many others, is sent to learn English and Christianity, yet the real lesson of State Jerome's is not about faith or education. It is about erasing indigenous culture. The teachers punish and humiliate the children until they reject their language, tradition, and identity. What the Canadian government presented as a noble act was in reality a violent attempt to destroy indigenous Canadian families and cultures. This cultural genocide, disguised as benevolent policy, tore families apart and left deep scars. As Walter Benjamin said, there is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Saul's journey in Indian Horse is a painful reminder of this dark chapter in Canadian history. The third theme we're going to discuss is abuse and trauma. In Indian Horse, Richard Wagamese explores the devastating effects of trauma, particularly sexual abuse. Saul, Indian horse, a young boy sent to a residential school, suffers abuse at the hands of Father Gaston Lebotelier, his trusted mentor. However, Vagamis doesn't reveal this trauma until later in the film, emphasizing the psychological truth that many victims of abuse repress their painful memories as a coping mechanism. Saul's relationship with Father Lebotelier complicates the abuse. The priest's apparent kindness makes the betrayal even more confusing. Saul buries the memories deep inside, yet the trauma still takes its toll. He isolates himself, battling depression and anger, unable to share his pain with others. Wagamis powerfully conveys that the aftermath of abuse, living with the suppressed memory and its effects, can be more painful than the abuse itself. Saul's isolation and self-loathing reflect the reality many abuse survivors face, struggling with guilt, loneliness, and the belief that no one will understand their suffering. However, Indinos also offers a glimmer of hope. Saul finds courage in sharing his story with the support of Fred and Malta Kelly, his adopted parents, who also suffered abuse. Saul begins to heal, talking about his trauma. Though talking about his trauma doesn't erase the pain, it enlightens his burden. Vagamis reminds us that healing is an ongoing process. While the scars of abuse remain, the support of loved ones like Fred and Kelly, his adoptive parents, and their courage to speak out offers survivors a chance to find peace. The next theme we're going to discuss is racism and prejudice. In Indian Horse, Saul Indian Horse faces the harsh reality of systemic racism that permeates every aspect of his life as a child. Saul is forcibly removed from his family and sent to State Jerome's, a residential school where he is forbidden from speaking his native language, forced to adopt foreign values, and treated as inferior. This institutionalized racism reflects a widespread belief in the superiority of white Canadian culture over indigenous cultures. At State Jerome's, the abuse Saul experiences at the hands of white teachers is rooted in the belief that Indigenous people are lesser than Canadian people, than the white people. The violence used to suppress Saul and his classmates' cultural identities is a direct manifestation of this prejudice, as they are told their ways are inferior, their language are meaningless. As Saul grows older, the racism he faces shifts to the hockey rink. Though a gifted player, he is still subjected to verbal abuse and violence from white teammates and opponents. When Saul beats his rivals on the ice, their anger and jealousy transform into aggression, fueling their need to degrade him with racial slurs and violence. His success in their eyes is a humiliation they cannot tolerate. Over time, the cumulative effect of racism eats away at Saul's spirit. Despite his talent, the constant barrage of hate and prejudice wears him down. He responds with anger and frustration, pushing away those who care about him. This path ultimately leads to this downfall as he is forced out of NHL, his dreams shattered by the very racism he cannot escape. The central tragedy of Indian Horse is not just Saul's lost athletic career, but how racism in all its forms crushes his potential and spirit. What could have been a bright futures overshadowed by years of abuse, bitterness, and isolation. This film forces us to confront the destructive power of racism and its lasting effect on individuals and the last theme we're going to discuss is transcendence. In Indian Horse, transcendence plays a vital role in Saul's survival to unimaginable hardship. Transcendence, a temporary escape from suffering, takes two forms for Saul: mystical visions, and the exhilaration of playing hockey. For brief moments, Saul feels liberated, soaring through life, far removed from the abuse and racism that surround him. Through mystical visions, Saul communicates with his ancestors, learning about his deep connection to his family and the land. The spiritual experience allow him to temporarily transcend the trauma of residential schools, finding solace and guidance from his ancestors, who help him understand the world in ways that transcend the harsh realities of his life. But transcendence also comes through the thrill of hockey. When Saul skates, he feels free, released from the weight of his painful past. The exhilaration of the sport offers him a temporary refuge, a place where he is not refined by the racism he faces or the suffering of his childhood. As Saul grows older, these moments of escape become harder to find. Hockey, once his refuge, becomes tainted by the same racism he experiences in everyday life. Even his mystical visions start to shift, no longer an escape but a reminder of the painful truths he must face. A vision of his great grandfather reveals deep sorrow, leading Saul to confront the abuse he endured. By the end of the film, Saul no longer seeks transcendence. Instead, he embraces a more mature form of survival. He still plays hockey, but he's aware of the prejudice that surrounds it. He carries the spiritual guidance of his ancestors within him rather than relying on brief transcendent moments of escape. Saul has learned to face his struggles head on, finding strength in his connection to his past, his family, and his own resilience. His journey is of painful growth, transforming transcendence into a lasting, deeper strength. In doing so, he begins to heal not by escaping his reality, but by confronting it with courage and wisdom. Thank you for listening to my documentary. I hope you will watch this film since it was a really good film.